My name is Nick Strimple. I'm a professor here at University of Southern California, Thornton School of Music. I also am the music director at Beverly Hills Presbyterian Church. I've, I've been in that job for 30 years. I work in the music industry in various capacities as an arranger and composer, and also as an expert witness in copyright infringement cases. I've been at the university for 10 years and teach the choral literature classes, the sacred music classes, cantata and oratorio for graduate voice majors, and music and the Holocaust, which is one of our diversity courses here at the university. Well, the function of that of a position of a minister of music or a director of music in a church, I think, changes with the church. Not even it used to be by denomination. Someone working in a Baptist church would be expected to know a completely different kind of repertoire than somebody working in an Episcopal church or a Catholic church, for instance. Now, the denominational differences are not so great in terms of music. Music directors in churches are expected to know a wide range of music, and not only in classical music, but all styles of music, pop styles and jazz and folk music, and because the congregations tend to be more diverse, and ministers may want a certain kind of music. One minister may want something, another one something else, especially if a church has more than one clergyman. They may have different services. Catholic churches, for instance, in Los Angeles, on any given Sunday morning in a large Catholic church, one mass will be a mariachi mass. It might be another mass that's a folk mass. It would be sort of American folk music, Caucasian folk music. There might be a mass, a high mass with a choir. There might even be a mass in Latin with a choir. So the music directors they need to be a lot more versatile and well versed in different styles than they used to be. There's also a need for church musicians to understand administration more than they used to, how to manage a program, especially a large program where you're dealing with different kinds of music and maybe different ensembles, really diverse ensembles, even knowing how to write grant proposals and things, even in a church. The challenges in a church today are a lot more than they used to be, because you have to be able to do a lot of different kinds of music. It isn't just the organ and the choir, and maybe occasionally bringing in brass for Easter. Many churches also have concert series where it isn't just the choir doing 2 or 3 concerts a year, a Christmas concert, a spring concert, something else, maybe with an orchestra that they hire to bring in. In fact, some very large churches have their own orchestras in-house made up of parishioners. But if a church has a concert series, they may also have chamber music, or they may bring in performers from other places to do concerts, and then the music director has to function as an impresario. So it's a little bit different than it was when I was first getting into the business 30, 40 years ago. Well, in the worship service, music director has to be able to, in my opinion, to match what is happening in the service. Some churches follow the liturgical calendar for the year, so the scripture readings are set, and the music director can plan accordingly pretty far in advance. Other churches, the ministers may not follow the lectionary, and it's a good idea for a minister of music to be able to work with these clergymen and plan what's going to happen well in advance so they have time to rehearse, and match the music to the scriptures, or even more than just matching to the scripture, to the particular inflection that the ministers are going to focus on. And that takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of knowledge of repertoire, knowledge of the hymnal of the particular denomination, and also experience in knowing how fast their choir can learn music, because they may have a perfect piece for a certain Sunday, but they don't have enough time to prepare it, so they have to look elsewhere for a piece of music. Well, there are a lot of workshops they can attend to enhance skills. Although most church musicians, at least in Los Angeles, their other job is involved in music somehow. They're either teaching at a university or a community college, or they're high school or middle school teachers, music teachers. So their conducting skills and their music teaching skills are being practiced every day. For those that are not in that situation, where they may be a bank teller or something, and then they on Thursday night and Sunday, they're working in a church. There are lots of workshops around the country, advertised in the Choral Journal and in various denominational journals. These are usually in the summer, but not always. The American Choral Directors Association conventions are usually in February and March, and there are always church music activities on those programs. In California, the American Choral Directors Association has a summer conference up just outside of Yosemite National Park that runs for about 4 days, and there are always church music clinics involved in that. So there are lots of ways to network with people who are also church musicians, and find out what's going on, and study for a short time with people who have gone through this before and are sharing their experience now, and they come to these workshops. There is always going to be a need for people in the field, because old church musicians die, both conductors and organists. The biggest need, I think, today is for organists. There was a big downturn in the number of organists in the country in the late 80s and 90s, and it's only now just getting built up again. We have a fairly large organ department here at SC. I think we have maybe 16 or 17 majors currently. Baylor University, I know, has a big organ program too, but most of the schools that have organ programs don't have as many majors. So there is a need for this, and especially now in the large mega churches, organ was not considered until now was not considered as necessary, and a lot of the big non-denominational mega churches were built without an organ, and they used essentially a pop band, guitars and drums. But a lot of those folks now are seeing the value of having, including tradition. And some of these churches are negotiating with organ companies to put in pipe organs, of all things, or combination electronic pipe organs. So, pardon me, even churches that were originally moving along the path of not having the traditional music with organ are now changing their tune. So I think there is an increased need for organists. In churches like the Episcopal denomination and others, there is the tradition of the organist choir master, where the organist conducts the choir from the organ. And those are in short supply too, so there is a need for that. All of the other churches need choir directors. I don't think anybody is actually throwing away choirs anymore. Well, there's always been since at least the 16th century, there's been great debate over what constitutes good church music or good sacred music, and what should be in it, whether it should be completely purged of so-called secular elements. And there was the Council of Trent in the 16th century had a lot to say about this. The Lutherans revolutionized things in the 16th century by increasing congregational participation and turning things into the vernacular, and borrowing sacred or secular tunes to use. The Calvinists, who became we know them in this country now as the Presbyterians or the Dutch Reformed Church, initially thought that the only music in church should be unison psalm singing without accompaniment. So you had at the same time these two diametrically opposed views of Protestant music. Then in the 17th century, the Catholic Church was sort of fighting with itself over this, where there was the new practice that was being made popular by opera, with concerted arias and very ornate music, as opposed to this pure Renaissance style that was deemed appropriate for the church. When we get to Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven, the opera style seems to have won out. And then in the 19th century, there is a reaction to this. An organization called the Sicilian Movement wants to go to purify church music again. In England, the Oxford Movement wants to purify church music. This is also in the 19th century. And then we come to the 20th century, and we have the same kinds of fights over whether or not you're going to do traditional music, church music, music by dead white guys, with European-sounding names, or if you're going to do music that is part of the American vernacular. And interestingly enough, the same sort of thing happened in the Jewish religion in the 19th century, as part of the reaction, or not a reaction, but an outgrowth of the Enlightenment. In Germany and Austria and France, large synagogues started developing choirs and creating music that essentially sounded like French music and German music and not Jewish music. And this has gone back and forth, and now in Reform and conservative Judaism, the issue of whether or not to use guitars and pop-related music as opposed to the traditional music, or what is now the traditional music for cantor and choir, this debate goes back and forth. And larger synagogues are able to come up with possibilities to do both, of course. But it's very interesting, this tension that goes back and forth between this desire to retain traditional elements and the desire to do something new in a church. You can see this dichotomy of the old and the new, this struggle back and forth, sometimes in the same work. For instance, the Mozart Vespers of the Confessor, one movement, the Laudate Pueri, is a very strict fugue in the old style, the contrapuntal style that would have been retained at that time as typical church music. And the next movement, the Laudate Dominum, is one of the most beautiful arias that Mozart ever wrote in the concerted style of opera, with the choir coming in at the end. And it's like night and day, and these are pieces that are adjacent to each other in the same piece. I think in the United States, the music has changed in the 20th century mostly by composers trying to accommodate a desire from congregants for a really approachable style with very direct expression doesn't necessarily mean that it uses pop, syncopations or something like that. It's just something that the congregation can go away and remember the music rather than, scratching their head wondering what that was about. In the early 1970s, there was a movement. This was when electronic music was first coming in among avant-garde composers, and there was a movement to try to create music for the church using electronic sounds. And I don't mean electric guitar or synthesizer. I mean the kind of electronic sounds that avant-garde composers use. And that didn't go very far, because the congregations couldn't relate to it at all. The congregations are still participating in traditional hymns, and many of the non-denominational churches, what are called praise songs are more prevalent. These are what we used when I was a kid. We'd call them camp songs. They're very simple, a lot of repeated text. They're didactic songs, really, and a lot of this kind of music has now migrated from more informal sessions among youth groups and children's groups into mainstream worship. Some churches will have both. They'll have a segment early in the service where they just will sing 5 or 6 praise songs, and then the service, in a more traditional way, will start after that with a few hymns and announcements and scripture readings, and the choir sings an anthem and minister preaches. I have to say, though, that the increased reliance on music of pop style came about during and immediately after the Vietnam War, when it was hard to get young people into the church. And there was an obvious, or clergy felt in many cases, that there was a need to entertain, to bring, to get young people to come in. And I'm sorry about that. That was an unfortunate development. But we certainly teach here that the music, whatever style you're using, the music has to be planned for each service so that it enhances the worship experience of the congregants. I think the newest trend is a return towards traditionalism. Robin Lever, my colleague at Westminster Choir College, showed pretty convincingly some years ago that pop music in worship, all the styles of pop music that are used in worship, are obsolete in the secular world by the time they get into the church. And so it actually isn't keeping pace with what's happening in the secular world. And many younger people, we first noticed this trend in weddings, and there have been statistical studies now that show this, where young people getting married started wanting traditional wedding music. And now there is this interest in putting organs in some of the big mega churches. I think that younger Americans began to realize that they were getting cut off at the knees culturally by not having any connection to tradition. I mean, let's face it, the one advantage that previous generations have that we don't is that they can still talk to us through their art. We can't communicate with them anymore, but they can still communicate with us. And especially, I think this is important in a religious situation, because people want to connect with their ancestors and, the faith of our fathers or faith of our parents. And people started realizing that the exclusive use of pop-related material was just as bad as the exclusive use of Eurocentric 19th or 18th century material. So there is now a trend to reincorporate traditional materials in churches where they haven't had it before. And I think that's the most important development right now. It's the most important development we've had in several years. Well, it's another kind of entertainment. You know, it's an entertainment with religious words. I don't think that it, in my view, it has no significance other than that. And I say that I arrange for some of these people. You know, I've done recordings with some Christian groups and Christian artists, but I also arrange for other pop singers, and it's, to me, it's the same. It's just a different kind of text.
You don't think that it necessarily enhances or brings in people into the religious community that wouldn't otherwise be there?
I really don't know that. I don't have an opinion on that. I know that it's very popular. I mean, 15, 20 years ago, there were no radio stations playing exclusively Christian music, for instance. But I'm just not convinced that it has anything to do ultimately with religion or with the Christian faith. I can't speak to Hinduism. I don't know how that works in terms of music. The Buddhist chanting is used for different purposes than Christian or Judaic music, which is really a congregational thing. My understanding of music in Islam is also that it has a very limited place. The chants of the people calling the faithful to prayer is one example of the use of music. There are also some men's organizations within Islam that who might compare to charismatics in the Christian church, where they gather and they have services that are really ecstatic, and it's chanting. It's not like we would sing different hymns. It's more like a mantra, but that's a use of music in Islam. I can't think of any others that just don't have any, but I don't know. I'm not acquainted with every religion in the world. I've just always been really interested in the literature itself, in the music, and in the composers that write the music, and the connections, the historical connections from one generation to another. And I like to write. And it's started really with my being, I gave a paper at a conference, and then I was asked to contribute a chapter to a book on the composer. It happened to be Dvorak. I was at a Dvorak conference. And so the book was about Dvorak's years in America from 1892 to 94, and so the book was all about the music that he wrote during this period, and I wrote the chapter on the two choral works that he wrote here, or just before he came here, and I got interested then in writing a whole book on Dvorak, and I contacted the publisher. This was a couple of years later, and they weren't interested in that, but they were interested in some aspect of choral music, because they realized they didn't have anything in the catalog, and they wanted to do that. So we talked for quite a while over what it would be, And I made some suggestions, and they came back at me with some suggestions. And they came back with, we finally settled on either a book on Mozart's choral music or a book on 20th century choral music. And I was more comfortable with the 20th century at the time. And it turned out that they wanted a written proposal within a week, because their editorial committee was meeting, and I was leaving the next day for the Baltics. I had some work there, so I remember writing the proposal on hotel stationery in Copenhagen, and I faxed it back from Tallinn, Estonia. And when I got back to Copenhagen on my return, there was a fax waiting for me from the publisher telling me that there would be a contract waiting for me when I got back to L.A. And that was in February of '97. And the book then came out. Well, they wanted to release it in '99 originally, but then as that time approached, we realized that a lot was going to be happening during the year of 1999. So we waited to be able to incorporate the more important of those things, like the Philip Glass Fifth Symphony and the four Passions that were commissioned by the Stuttgart Bach Academy for the 250th anniversary of his death and things like that. And it came out in 2000. So that's how that started. Choral Music in the 20th Century is the name of the book. There are some trends that can be seen. There was a renewed interest in folk-related materials and inspiration from folk music. Even the major teacher of the century, who could be said to be Nadja Boulanger, encouraged her students to explore the folk music of their country. Even Elliott Carter, who studied with her, some of his first works then were arrangements of American folk songs. He withdrew all of those. They were published, but he withdrew them all as his own artistic path went in another direction. As the century went on and we moved closer to the 21st century, there was more and more interest in adding various visual aspects to choral music, either incorporating dance or some kind of stage movement for the choir. In the United States, the phenomenon of the show choir started. It was just like dancer or the chorus and dancers in a Broadway musical doing a whole program of tunes where they're singing, but as a choir, but they're moving around on stage constantly. So that was an aspect that wasn't in place at the beginning or even up to the first half of the century. You can also see that, at least in the United States and in some parts of Europe, the choral music is much more conservative than other kinds of music in terms of harmony. And also in the 20th century, areas that did not have well-developed choral tradition, it started all through the Pacific Rim. In the Philippines, for instance, there had been a lot of choral music in the Catholic churches there, but it had all been imported from Spain. There was no choral music by Philippine composers until about 1963, and then in Taiwan and China and Japan and Korea especially, efforts of European missionaries at the end of the 19th century started bearing fruit in terms of choral music, because those cultures' vocal traditions were not like ours, with a choir, standing up and singing, and now they all have the same kind of tradition in conjunction with their own folk traditions. So it was a very eventful century. It's a prequel to the 20th century book. The 20th century book has been very successful, and the publisher decided to go backwards. So it's laid out in the same way. Everything is covered by country or region, and in the same order as it is in the 20th century book. It's chronological from the beginning of the century. It actually starts in 1796 with the late Haydn masses, which kick off 19th century music, really, not just choral music. And it gives some background on other developments in the 18th century that caused 19th century choral music to develop the way it did, just a little background. It focuses on not only the compositions and the composers, but also on the development of choirs throughout the world. It's not as big as the 20th century book because there's virtually no choral activity in the Pacific Rim, at least as it was in the 20th century. The Asian countries have nothing. The Philippines they still don't have their own composers writing music for them. They're doing the music that the Spanish colonists brought. Choral music is just starting in Australia around the middle of the century. A lot of it by German immigrants who start big men's choirs and men's choir festivals. So the 19th century book is not as thick as the 20th century book, but it's the same format, where we start chronologically and we look what happens in each country where choral music was a player. There was a lot of music that was either performed or actually written in Nazi concentration camps during World War II. Also in Nazi Germany during the 30s. Really, concentration camps started within a week or two of Hitler becoming chancellor in 1933. Those camps were mostly for political prisoners, but in some cases there were songs written in the camps. And the Nazis organized something called the Jewish Cultural Organization, the Jüdische Kulturbund. When Jews were removed from the civil service and couldn't go to the theaters or the movie houses, the Jüdische Kulturbund in the large cities provided concerts and theater for the Jewish community. This is in the 30s. So, and the Jewish musicians that had been kicked out of the German orchestras then became part of the orchestras in the Jüdische Kulturbund. So we will deal with this. We'll deal with the music then that occurs in the camps and the ghettos after the war starts. In the eastern ghettos, mostly in Poland, Lithuania, there was this great tradition of Yiddish song. And Yiddish folk song is all about life. There are songs about everything. And they simply wrote new songs about life in the ghetto under the Nazis, or they created Holocaust-specific texts for pre-existing songs. There's an enormous body of that has not been fully researched yet. There were, in the concentration camps, and in Auschwitz, for instance, there were orchestras, a men's orchestra and a women's orchestra, that were actually not, organized by the Nazis, for use to, the women had to play on the platform when the trains came in, and they also played for functions for the Nazi officers and things like that. In other camps like Theresienstadt, or in Czech it's the town of Terezín, they just organized concerts for themselves, and composers were writing music, and they staged operas and even wrote 2 operas in that camp. In the transit camps in Western Europe, in Holland and France, they also were allowed to have, because the Nazis wanted people to think that they were just being relocated. So they actually had budgets. The camp commandants had budgets for the people to stage cabaret shows and have concerts and things like that. So there was, people found ways to make music. They also, a lot of art came out of the camps, drawings and things. There is a large body of material in the National Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., mostly on microfilm of the materials that were located in camps like Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen. The primary sources still mostly exist for Terezín in the Jewish Museum in Prague, or in Terezín. A lot are still in the museum in Terezín. There are also still a lot of survivors who remember songs because, for instance, in Terezín, we know that there were at least 200 arrangements of folk songs made for children's choirs to sing. But in most cases, they weren't written down because there wasn't enough paper. And if they were written down, there would only be one copy, and then they would teach the children the arrangement by rote. So a lot of it is interviewing survivors who were involved in that as children to just try to remember what songs they sang, so we can compile some kind of record of what was done, not necessarily how they did it, but what songs were sung. In some cases, in camps like Terezín, people, when the camp was liberated, they walked off with the material. And much of that has been relocated by a man named Jože Karas, who just started nosing around Prague and talking to people. This was in the 70s, back in the 70s. So in some cases there were recordings made at the time. The Nazis made a recording in Terezín. In camps that were not actually concentration camps, but civilian internment camps that also had Jews in them, international agencies were allowed access, as if the same way as they were allowed access to prisoner of war camps. And Swedish radio had a program called From Behind Barbed Wire. They went around to these camps and interviewed people and recorded concerts and things like that. And those program tapes are still in the vault at Swedish Radio in Stockholm. So there are a lot of primary sources available. Well, I can read German. I'm in good shape as long as it's in German. I have a graduate student who is French, whose father is a survivor, who has helped me quite a bit locating French sources and translating them for me. I can read Czech a little bit, and I have a lot of friends in Prague that got me involved in the whole Holocaust scheme to begin with. So they're very helpful. The Polish materials, we have the Polish Music Institute here at USC, is very helpful. The reason that all of these composers set the Mass text is that in the Catholic Mass there are 2 different categories of text. One is called the ordinary, and one is called the proper. The proper are the texts that are only that are used on a specific Sunday, like texts that are for Christmas or texts that are for Easter. The ordinary is said every Mass, every day of the year. And those are the 5 sections that composers have focused on making musical settings of. And they've done it, usually because they were Catholic and they were hired by the church in some way to provide music, or they wanted to do it. And they knew it would be performed because every church in close proximity to them was going to do a Mass every week, but that text. And, you don't want to do the same music every week. So Schubert, for instance, had a habit of leaving out the texts that he didn't agree with, because he was really a free thinker. He had the most tenuous of connections to the Catholic Church, but he wrote 6 Masses, and they all omit text. Beethoven in the Missa Solemnis got into trouble in the opposite direction by adding a word for emphasis. O is miserere nobis. He adds O. Well, that renders the piece inappropriate for the liturgy. Suddenly it's not part of the liturgy anymore. Mozart had severe time constraints placed on him by the Archbishop in Salzburg. He wanted Mass, including all the music. He wanted Mass over with in 45 minutes or so. So Mozart, in the Credo and the Gloria, would have the soprano singing part of the text and the alto singing the next line of text, and the tenors at the same time, because he'd get the text out of the way, so the Mass would be over with within the Archbishop's time frame. So they all approached the text differently and had to, for their own reasons. Haydn did us a great service with his last 6 Masses in coming to grips with the problem of simultaneous, setting different texts simultaneously. He figures out how not to do that at all. He standardizes pretty much the length of a musical setting of a Mass, at least an orchestral Mass, at about 40 minutes. He uses symphonic first movement form, the sonata form, for the opening movement of the Mass, which becomes more or less standard practice after that too. He and his harmonic language in the late 6 Masses focuses a lot on tonal movement to mediant relations. So he modulates to keys a third away, which is not unheard of, but he does it so consistently here in the late Masses that it becomes, you see it very clearly in both of Beethoven's Masses, and then it becomes standard practice in Schubert, and tonal movement to mediant keys becomes a standard practice in the 19th century. So Haydn opens up a whole door with his last of exploration for later composers with the last 6 Masses. Very important pieces. If a pop song is a hit, chances are that somebody is going to claim that the writer and the artist stole it from them. And the issue legally becomes not so much that the music piece A sounds like piece B, but there are lots of legal issues in terms of prior access. If the defendant had access to the plaintiff's music in one way or another, either by actually seeing the music or maybe they heard it played at a cocktail party or something like that. And another big issue is whether it existed already in public domain art. Not only the defendant's song, but the plaintiff's songs. There's some prior piece of music that can be said that both pieces were, borrowed something from or were based on. So most of the musicological work, if you're working for the defendant, is finding predecessors, finding music that you can say, this already exists in prior art. If you're working for the plaintiff, you're trying to show how the defendant's song actually, prior art notwithstanding, the defendant's song actually did, the things are too close for comfort. It's too similar. And, you just have to either chart that out if you're working for the plaintiff, and if you're working for the defendant, you have to go digging around the library for lots of music. And there are ways to show, you come up with ways to show that the fact that the notes are the same doesn't mean anything. A standard example of that is the hymn Rock of Ages, and the popular Christmas song Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. The notes are the same. The rhythm is different, but the pitches, the sequence of pitches are exactly the same at the beginning of the songs. So, you're just smoke and mirrors a lot. I was early in my career. I was working at the church, and I was trying to get a foot in the film and recording industry here in L.A. And I became friends, really good friends, with Ralph Edwards, the television producer. At that time, he was one of the shows he had on the air was the $300,000 Name That Tune. And he had a musicologist working for him whose job was to get clearances, and he knew a lot of people in the music business, in both film and television. And Ralph introduced me to him, and I just became his assistant. And when he wasn't doing the Name That Tune, one of his primary sources of income was working as an expert witness. And I started working with him. I was the guy doing all of the research in the libraries and helping him write his reports and this sort. So that's how I got into it. I'm a teacher. One of the great things about the USC Thornton School is that we have a long-standing tradition here of faculty who are artist teachers. They're not performers first and teachers second, or teachers. They are artist teachers. I would like to think that I fall into that category because I still have an active career as a conductor and a composer and arranger. But I enjoy teaching, I think, more than anything. I am, as most performers, most musicians we're compelled to do what we do. I mean, it would be much easier to get a job as an insurance agent or something, but we're compelled to perform or to write or whatever. The teaching, for me, it's just wonderful to be able to share what has happened in my career with people who are just starting out, not only academically, but they're starting their professional careers, especially in choral music, where choral music is a kind of a strange hybrid. It's part academic in the sense that you do research and you're very involved in music history and also music theory. On the other hand, you're performing. And there is no satisfaction like the satisfaction of seeing students get it. You know, it's incredible. And we're fortunate here because we attract very bright kids. And they keep me on my toes. More than working in the studios or with professional orchestra or something like that. You know, they keep you on your toes in a different way, but the students, they keep me learning too. You know, it's not a matter of me just lecturing and giving a test, because their questions are very pointed most of the time, and it sends me back to do more research, you know, but it's great. It's fantastic. I think the primary thing that I strive for is that they understand somehow that everything is connected. We don't live in a vacuum. We don't create art in a vacuum. What people in previous generations have done impacts us, and we can still learn from it. It can still speak to us. Our audiences usually are more interested in hearing that music than they are hearing something now anyway. But if we understand that, then we understand that what we do is going to impact somebody down the line, so that the connection remains unbroken in culture. And I think it's very important today to understand that the connection is wider than we used to think it was. We don't. One of the great things about the United States is this boiling pot, melting pot culture, where all of these different cultural attributes have come together, and we can use all of these as Americans. You know, we can use the Hungarian ancestry of my neighbor across the street. My street is like a United Nations. We have a Hungarian couple, a Filipino couple, a couple from Iceland, black and white and Asian, and all mixed together. And this is typical of the whole country. And all of these different ethnic groups have their own music and their own art that they bring to the party. And now, you know, we can get involved in all of these aspects to create an art that's uniquely American. It doesn't have to be Eurocentric anymore. And this is a very exciting thing, and yet we can't lose sight of the European ancestors either. So what I think the most important thing for someone leaving this institution that comes through my classes, besides the purely technical aspects of being able to conduct a four pattern or understanding that Beethoven comes after Mozart or something like that, is to understand this connection. And that's true in every class, the Holocaust class too. That's what I strive for.
Thank you very much for talking to us today.
Thank you for talking with me.